welcome. Great to have you here tonight. My name is Dave Patterson. I'm one of the librarians here, and on behalf of the whole library crew, we're so glad to have you here at College of Marin Library. It's such a pleasure to see you all, and we hope you'll stay afterwards. We have cookies, and I even brought some grapes. Someone said you should have healthy snacks, so we have both healthy and unhealthy. Tonight, it's a great pleasure to have Professor Susan Rahman and her students here talking about the awesome project Censored. Project Censored is something I learned about when I became a librarian here from Susan. She had the students come to the library to do research, and I have to say, Susan, it was the hardest research I've ever led. You know, librarians are often asked, help the students find books about gun control, help the students find books about abortion or same-sex marriage. So I'm used to controversy, but the complexity of the assignment was really a wonderful challenge for the librarians, and we always are so proud when Project Censored comes out each year because our own students have helped to produce it. Tonight's event is part of our year-long festival called Common Read. Common Read is a play on the acronym COM, College of Marin. It's a reading program that's done here the whole year. It started on the first day of school in August, and it'll end on the last day of school in May. And it works like this. We pick a book, and everyone's invited to read it. And we have one giant book club, the College of Marin. And you're all invited to read it too. The book this year is Hidden Figures. Did I bring up a copy? Thank you. Thank you. Hidden Figures. How many people have seen the movie or read the book? Yeah, okay, great. And because it's about African American women who had to deal with both sexism and racism, at the same time they were brilliant mathematicians, it gives us a wonderful opportunity to spend the whole year talking about how do we overcome oppression of all kinds, especially sexism and racism, and how do we celebrate mathematics. So behind you, right back there, are multiple copies that were bought by the associated students of College of Marin and the college, and they wanted everyone who wants a copy to have one. So if you would like to take a book home, it's yours for life, and if you want, you can write in it, you can give it to your grandmother or your little brother or your friend. If you want to bring it back, we can give it to someone else who wants it when you're done. But the idea is, let's consider how these extraordinary women did what they did. And tonight's event fits in with that beautifully. So I'll just introduce Susan very briefly. When I first started working here about 4 years ago, Susan was one of the first people I met, and she just struck me as such a compassionate and rigorous professor. We've all had professors who were compassionate, and we've all had professors who were rigorous, but she's both. And you couldn't ask for a better instructor, someone who's committed to social justice, committed to critical thinking. I helped her a tiny bit when she was putting the finishing touches on her dissertation, which is about women in Palestine. I helped her with forming some citations, go librarians. And so I feel like I've contributed a tiny bit, and I just felt so lucky to call her my colleague and my friend. So can you please help me welcome Susan Rahman?
Ditto, back at you. He did more than help with my dissertation. He got my citations legit so that I could get my PhD, so I feel like I owe him a little bit, one of the reasons I'm here tonight, but I'm also here because this is a fun thing to do. He's probably one of the few people that ever even read my dissertation, besides people that were obligated because they loved me, but yeah, you're awesome. I don't know if you've ever looked at dissertations before, but they're not that interesting. I think mine was very interesting personally, but you know, I'm probably biased. So I'm not alone. As you can see, I brought with me some women that I think are amazing and brilliant, all in their own right, with lots of different reasons that they are so. We're all here thematically because we're all part of Project Censored. We all do different tasks for the project throughout school careers, following school careers after. So these brilliant women will have a turn to kind of tell you what they've done and how that's made a difference in their lives. And maybe I'm stretching it, I don't know how different their lives are, but perhaps they're very different. So to tie in with the Hidden Figures theme, that's about underrepresented populations in an area where there wasn't a lot of space for women, especially women of color. So when David asked me to come talk, I was like, Project Censored, how am I going to do this, right? And so I had to think about journalism and women in journalism in general. And so I guess what I would start with is by saying that numerically we make up half the population, right? I mean, I don't think that's rocket science. We probably all know that. And yet, we're not half the journalism population. We're certainly not half the science population. So, what's up with that? Well, if you're in my gender class, maybe you're spending some time exploring those issues. But for the layperson at the event tonight, I guess we'll just say that we consider that to be something that's worth exploring and kind of learning about, and then also trying to figure out what ways there are to change that. And I guess I would just throw it out there for you. Why would it be important to have multiplicity of voices in our journalism?
Less biased.
Less biased, sure. Mallory.
I was trying to say that if all of the voices in journalism are coming from the same demographic, then you're going to have that demographic's general bias.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I'm not sure how much people know about journalism or media or who owns it or any of that, but what it ends up being is a small group of people controlling most of the information that we see, read, and hear. And so the part that I think is exciting is the Project Censored piece that I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to talk a little bit about first kind of what led us to thinking that that's an important thing to do. How many of you are familiar with Chomsky and Herman's book? Okay, so a couple of you. I'm sure it's here, and I actually should have asked you to pull it out, but perhaps you could check it out and read it. But let me make sure I'm not getting too far ahead in my, what am I talking about? Oh, no, go back. So Prezzies I love them, but they also give me problems. So Manufacturing Consent is the book, and it's Chomsky and Herman, 1988. And what they're talking about is this, what they call the propaganda model. And basically, it's explaining how systematic bias and propaganda are prevalent in mainstream media. And what they say is it's because of these 5 filters. Okay, so how many of you have heard of this? My panel ought to be raising their hand. They should all know this, right? So these 5 filters are what they call ownership, advertising, source, flack, and fear, which was originally thought of as anti-communism. And so I always have to remember the acronym because whenever I lecture this, I'm like, OASFF. Oh yeah, okay. So bear with me if I get them out of order or whatever. But so basically, if we're thinking about the media being sort of biased and kind of tainted by certain things, what would ownership have to do with that? Can you think about that? Like if I say ownership is one of the things that is a problem within media bias, does anybody think, oh, maybe I have an idea? Go for it.
Maybe that they control what is given out to the public?
Absolutely, absolutely. So what we know is that 6 conglomerates or companies owned about 90% of our media, right? So that's a very small amount of people kind of giving us what is newsworthy, what is important. And, if we think that having a wide variety of options in other things, like food or, what you might wear, or that kind of stuff, doesn't it make sense that we should also have that in terms of the media we consume? Yeah, right? So this small ownership of most of the news sources that you probably access to get information about what you might think is important is being controlled by a really small group of people with very similar frames of reference, okay? So that's important, right? That's something to be thinking about. Then the second one is advertising. So advertising is all about the almighty dollar, right? So most media sources need advertisers. They need them in order to keep their lights on or keep their switches on or whatever. Printing press is going. So they choose to target specific things that they believe media sources do in order to attract the advertisers. So I don't know if any of you pay attention to any sort of television or anything you consume, but the commercials that are aligned with it, like Super Bowl commercials or typically female shows and what commercials they're showing versus, I don't know, typically male shows. Look, I'm going to change my voice and my face when I say it. That's okay. But if you think about it, it's like, what is the point of that? The point of that is to get as many people to consume their products, right? And so in some ways, we are the product being sold to the advertiser, right? Herman and Chomsky would say that in some ways, we are the good. So if there's, 50,000 women watching a woman show?
Oprah.
Okay, Oprah is, I don't even know if that's a thing anymore, but say they're watching Oprah, right? So they're all then potentially, the advertisers want those women because they want them to hear, oh, you need this, I don't know, soap, whatever, and so it's important for that audience to hear that sort of stuff. I feel like I'm talking loud in the library.
That's okay. It's great. It's subversive.
And then, so that's advertising. And my panel can jump in anytime, just FYI. And then the next one is sources. And sources is where are you getting your information, right? Who are sources? And so if you read any newsprint or internet articles or whatever, they're often saying, so-and-so, a whatever, said blah, 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 right? So who are these sources? Who are the people that we consider to be newsworthy enough, important enough, that we're going to ask them their opinion, right? And so we typically go to sources that are
aligned with the military or government or the media company.
often white men, but other times other people in power. But in terms of who gets to tell the story, who the source is, again, that's sort of perpetuating that same narrative, right? Because it's still that group of people not only controlling what media gets out there, but then whose voices get heard. And what I would say is that's problematic, right? I mean, I would absolutely say that's problematic. There's not enough diversity of sources. That's why grassroots journalism is so great, right? People on the ground, people interviewing people, right? Goodness gracious. So I went to Palestine and I interviewed women who lived there, right? Women who lived there. They weren't fancy. They didn't have a title. They were just women who lived there. But guess what? They could tell me what it was like on the ground there because they had the lived experience. Whereas sometimes those experts might not really even know what's going on and they're just kind of telling you what the storyline is that they're getting. Or they're telling you a story that they want you to put out there. So sources are another issue. Flack is the fourth one. And basically flack is, if I run this story, am I going to get a lot of grief? Is this story worth telling? So I would then go back to Palestine, because most people don't even want to cover Palestine, because it is one of those ones that you're going to get flack for, right? You start talking about that, you're going to get flack. So that filter kind of keeps the mainstream media somewhat mainstream, if you get what I'm saying. And then the last one is fear. And fear is kind of insidious because this plays on our fear and then it's targeted. So it used to be called anti-communism. So if we were looking at fear now, who are we supposed to be afraid of in this country?
Islam says.
Mm-hmm.
The president?
Well,
According to mainstream media. This is true.
so if you're watching CNN though,
Yeah.
So the corporate media is kind of then just giving you this perspective of like, these are the people we need to be afraid of and this is why. And then you kind of just consume it over and over and over and over until we have half the population thinking that all Arabs are terrorists. That's astounding, if you ask me, astounding. So these filters then block the idea of actual news, the real information, what's actually newsworthy, what actually is a news story, because it's all spun by these filters to kind of, in many ways, to keep us following the standard line. And so, again, I find this problematic, and so do people at the project. And so I'll tell you a little bit about the project, I'll tell you how it works for me as a teacher, and then I'll have my students, former students and friends, tell you about what it looks like for them. So Project Censored is 41 years old, started at Sonoma State, and it's a media research project that, I'm just not very good at this little machine tonight. There you go. Well, there's a picture of it. That allows students to seek out news that is not covered in mainstream media necessarily. So this came out of Nixon era, Watergate. People were wondering, how in the world did this guy get reelected, right? After they almost impeached him. And so Carl Jensen was a professor at Sonoma State University, and he said, I think it has a lot to do with the media, and here's what I think we should do. We should start looking at media and paying attention to what kind of narratives are being told, and let's look at alternative media. And now, mind you, 41 years ago, how do you guys find your stories, first of all? How do you go get them?
The internet.
There was no internet, okay? So what these students had to do was they would get like Mother Jones and other kind of progressive magazines sent to the college, and then he would throw a pile on the table, and he'd break the students up and be like, okay, find me some stories that are important. And so then they would come together and they would find these stories, and then what they would do with those stories is they would summarize them, and then they would share them with the project. And so the project started with an annual edition of book. But now we use a website, so it's sort of morphed with the future and all of the technology that we have available to us. But basically, what we do is a student gets a choice. I give them options. Whoever the teacher is will give them options. You know, here's a list of independent media sources, or at this point, I think a lot of students already are really good at like knowing what independent news sources are and being able to go look at them themselves. And so they probably all have favorites. You know, I really like looking at whatever. I like color lines. I like the News Times. I don't know what they like, but they might tell you what they like. But once they do that, then their job is to find a story, summarize it, and submit it to me. And then I vet it. Like, I make sure that I can't find it in corporate media, because the purpose of this is to bring forward stories that aren't being covered in corporate media, right? Who are these independent journalists telling truths that are not being covered? And so this raises the visibility of the article for the original author, and then it just is a project for students that is really great in terms of critical thinking and media literacy. So I like Project Censored, and I like that it makes space for lots of voices. So in a world of journalism where it is somewhat white male dominated, statistically speaking, Project Censored, although run by some men, make a lot of space for us. And I actually sit on the board now, and so part of my goal is to be diversifying and femaling that board a little more, and I will be doing that. But as you can see here, these are some contributing authors to the book, and they're all, well, you can see them. You can see who they are. So I'm going to just bring them up one at a time and let them tell you kind of about what they've done for the project and maybe just what it's felt like. So it looks like I've got you guys first. So you could, do you want to come or do you want to, it's whatever you want. It's whatever you want, because you're doing me a favor by coming. So you can't go first.
Oh, I can.
Well, unless I change my slide, which of course I can change my slide. Let me knock at the door. There you go. Come on.
Hi, so my name is McCoy, I have actually been working with Project Censored since I started at College of Marin, which was about 3 years ago, something along those lines. A friend of mine was taking one of Susan's classes, and this is also how I met Susan, and Project Censored was having an event at Copperfield Books, and I went with her, and I heard what Nikki Huff, one of the current forerunners of the project, had to say, and I was super interested in it. And so I signed up for one of Susan's classes for the next semester and became really involved in Project Censored. I'm actually one of their interns, but since I live in the East Bay with no car, I don't get up here to the North Bay to their events very often. I personally have been published in 3 of the Project Censored books. I was published in the 2017, 2016, and I believe 2015 books. And up on the screen is part of an article that I wrote that made it to the 2017 book. It was story number 18 out of 25, voted by a whole panel, including students who participate, about the rise number of transgender people murdered in the year 2016 and 2017. This story was also revisited in the 2018 book I saw, which is great, but also terrible. Like, it's really upsetting that this is something that has to come back again and again. Though you can read about it yourself, I'm not going to rehash the article. One of the things that I really like about Project Censored is it gives you a really good sense of what is going on in your world and also what other students are interested in. Because you pick and choose your own articles, you pick and choose your own things to write about. Sorry, I say it wrong. And the great thing about that is you get not only this different perspective from non-mainstream corporate media, but you get this different perspective from your fellow students who are working on the project as well. And then when you take a look at the book, and when you take a look at the website, you get even more perspectives from students all over the world who are a part of this. The other great thing about Project Censored is when you start talking to people about it, when you start explaining the need for it, they get it almost right away. If you say, mainstream media reports on the same, 24 things every month, people get it, like they know. You watch the news and it'll talk about, I think at one Project Censored event I said something like, whatever's happening in Kim Kardashian's life doesn't affect how I can pay the rent. I would much rather that the news tell me about the fact that AC transit prices are going up and what they plan on doing with that money than what is happening to Kim Kardashian. I don't really care that much about Kim Kardashian. I don't really care that much to necessarily watch, 25 minutes of college football breakdown. Like, I have nothing against college football, but I personally don't feel that 25 minutes of an hour about, that's supposed to be news about my community, news about my county, news about the country I live in, should be focused on a sports event. Like, these are things that are very important to certain people. But when you're talking about things that affect an entire community, who scored the, winning inning of the second quarter in that college football game is not it. If you're talking about how people are going to be able to vote or how people are going to be able to make money or pay for their health care, the mainstream news media doesn't cover those things. When we look at election coverage, it's all about big ticket items. It's all about the presidency. Like, anybody who was looking at the news or got saturated with it last fall remembers it was all about the presidency. There is never any mainstream news coverage, even on a city or county level, about what is on your ballot. And that's insane. But these news conglomerates decide what news you get based on what the people who pay for ad space tell them, essentially. They want to sell you something, and they want to sell you to someone. And so it's not within their best financial interest to talk about things that are not within the best financial interest of their media donors, essentially. So Project Censored is really great in that it circumvents all of that. You're not talking about media donors, you're not talking about advertising revenue, you're talking about students who find things that are not in those news sources that are still very important. Because there are things happening in the world that are super important that you're not going to see on the 6 o'clock news. Because it is not of interest to the people who pay for the 6 o'clock news to be there. And that's just the plain fact of it. So, Project Censored has been really important to me. Like, that's kind of the sum and substance of what I'm up here to tell you. Project Censored is also, I think, really important to a lot of students because it teaches you to look at things critically. It teaches you to think about the news that you hear and the news that you read and go, okay, but what am I not hearing? Or what am I hearing too much of? Like, what are they wasting my time with? And what do I really need to hear about? And how do I find that information? And where do I go and where can I talk to a person about that? It's so incredible how much the news has changed just over the course of my life, and I'm only in my mid-30s. So, Project Censored presents this platform. It presents this way for students to be connected, right? And to be connected with the news that is important to them, and also to how to find that news. And I don't know anyone who has done a Project Censored report, barring the few who hate reports of all kinds, which I say, I'm sorry, but you're in academia. Reports aren't part of life. Who did not get something out of it, who did not feel better for having participated in Project Censored, and who doesn't tell someone else about it. Like, that's the great thing. Like, you do Project Censored, and then you want to tell other people about Project Censored. You want to tell other people about how to find news. You want to tell other people about the website. You want to tell other people about the thing that you wrote about that's really upsetting that nobody is talking about on the 6 o'clock news. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
Who wants to go next? Should I just go back and see where I'm at? No, do you want to? Oh, okay. Yes, no. Okay. No, that's fair enough. That's fair, right? That's fair. Well, I'm just, okay, let's do it backwards. Okay, so it's, you can thumb wrestle for it. One of you guys come on.
I'll go.
Yay, Bri! Bri.
Hi, my name is Bri, and I am a former student of Susan's and an avid participant in the Project Censored everything, I guess. I'm not a student anymore, but like Caitlin, I was thumbing through one of the other books. I was published in, I believe, it doesn't matter, one of the older ones, but the one that I'm super proud of is the one that's in last year's book. The title is U.S. military forces deployed in 70% of the world's nations. This is kind of important right now because those 4 soldiers that were killed in Niger that a lot of people didn't know about. Some of our senators didn't even know that we had a military presence in this country. I did because I researched it and I found out. And I wrote a story and I summarized that story for Project Censored because I thought it was super important and that people should know about it. The American people should know where our military is and what we're doing, in my opinion. And because we don't know, these terrible things happen and then we want to place blame on people and, you know, whatever. Huh? Why do they hate us? Yeah, well. There's a long answer. Here, right here. Oh, there you are, in recent years. Yeah, so I'm not going to read that. I'll let you guys read it. Yeah, you can buy the book. Susan has copies of this year's book for sale. They're $20. You should totally buy one. Expand your mind.
We have some other years, like prior years, available to 2014 through 2018.
Also for sale. Feel free to buy one.
I want to talk.
Okay, and then Susan wants to go, so I'm finished.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to say one thing, like kind of how the process works, because I feel like they're getting up there telling you stuff like you already know. So they might not know, right? So these submissions that they do, they go into this giant pool of like, so we work with about 20 campuses worldwide. We have a couple international and then many across the country. It used to be just Sonoma State, but then it's grown. Obviously, College of Marin does it. When I worked at Santa Rosa, I did it there. And so all teachers that choose to do this in a classroom then have their students doing these submissions, and they're picking out their most important story, and they're writing it up, and then we're turning it into the project. So the project ends up with like 200 or 300 stories every year, and then we get a national panel of judges, and they're usually journalists and respected journalists and people with skills that we've had Chomsky as a panel before, years back. Just a collective of judges, and then they rank the stories top 25. And so every year's edition has the top 25 in the book, and kind of for people that follow this project, they're curious to know what are the top 25 stories. And so Caitlin's had a couple stories in that count in her tenure, and Bri, the story that she didn't tell you this, but the African story about the secret expansion of the United States into Africa in mass proportions was the #1 story in the book prior to this year's book, because it's a really important story, but you're probably not learning about it from your mainstream media. And you might be learning about the Kardashians, but you're probably not learning about the fact that we're expending energy and lives in another country for resources that may or may not be important to be fighting for. So anyways, that's kind of how the process works. And so students get excited about entering their stories and then seeing if they come into the top 25. And I get excited too. I get really, as soon as I get the book, sometimes I get a little preview of like, oh, 4 of your students are in. But as soon as I get the book, I gotta flip through and see who made it. So it's kind of exciting. Yeah, so I'm, because really I want all my students to always win, because, that's the way it works. But anyways, so Liliana, come on up and you can tell us a little bit about your deal too.
Hi, so my name is Liliana. I met Susan 2011. And that was in Columbus, and I was a JC. When I went to her class, it was very different from all the classes that I went to. I had just gone out of ESL because I'm an English learner. So I had just gotten out of ESL. So that was my first class with just English speakers, and that was very exciting. And then I got a teacher, an amazing teacher that made me get out of my comfort zone, made me think about other things, and made me think about issues that were deeper than the media were portraying. When I started Project Censored, I took it as more like okay, let's do this, it's interesting. But then when I got into it, I got really into it. I got published 5 times, and then I got 2 chapters with her. I believe it was 2013 and 2014. Maybe I'm mistaken it. I know for sure it's a 14, you can see it here. I see my name and I get very excited. One of my goals in life was to get published, to write something, and I kind of achieved that through Project Censored, which makes me really happy. But at the same time, I got to experience critical thinking, and I believe that every person in life should experience this and should really think about the topics that or the things that matter to you in life, and think about them deeper rather than just superficial. Like I said, I'm an English speaker, but it's my second language. So immigration was always an issue that interests me, and that's where the route that I went through when I started looking for my stories. My story was top 20, I believe, and it was about this, I think it was farmers, honestly, it's been so long, and it was in Alabama. Farmers were out of workers because people were migrating from that state due to the E-Verify, so they were trying to use prisoners to kind of make up for everything that they needed. So they will go and pick up their fruit, and then you get no pay. So that's kind of like slavery. Didn't want to say the word, but yes. So I can go on and tell you what my experience was, but to sum it up, it really opens your world. It really opens your mind, and it lets you go into other things and think about others and put yourself in other people's shoes. I never thought about Palestine, and when I met her, I started thinking about it, and I was like, wow, that's a big issue, and I never thought about it. I started thinking about African American people, how they live their lives, and how much discrimination they get. And I'm like, that's just like me. People see me and I look Hispanic. Yes, I'm Mexican. So some people have stereotypes about me. But I never thought about other people. I thought just, okay, I'm in my own little world and I think about my own issues. But with Project Censored, I saw the world and I saw how much bigger it was. So for any student or any person that wants to join, because even if you're not a student, you can join, I recommend it. Just try it. If you don't like writing, it's fine. You can just contribute to the project or help in any way that you can. But honestly, look for things that are not being portrayed in mainstream media. Look for issues that matter to you and bring them to life. Bring them to the light where everything's shining, but no one's looking. So that's my story.
I won't tell. I've known Liliana for a very long time, so we go way back. Oh, we're in the movie. Yeah, there's a movie. There's a Project Censored movie, and we're both in it. Because we're movie stars, just in case you're wondering. I'm a movie star. So I'll give you autographs later if you want them. Hilda, come on.
Hi, my name is Zeinab, and I'm a new immigrant to the United States. I'm from Morocco. And as an Arab, we are very critical to U.S. foreign policy. And I grew up in a country where propaganda is something just normal. But it's heavy-handed propaganda. No one trust the news. The news is just like for the regime, that's okay. So we tend to look for news from outside countries, and especially Europe press, but also American press. But I know from the beginning, since I'm very young, that American press and Europe press is biased. Just if we hear how they cover the Middle Eastern news, we know that because we have other sources. But I have to say I was not aware at all about the domestic situation. Before I came to the US, well, I thought that the US was a kind of democracy island, and kind of and democracy island inside and outside, throwing wars everywhere for their own resources. And really, Project Censored opened my eyes to many things, like surveillance, like racism institutionalized, sorry, I forgot to use some words, mass incarceration, all the things that you hear in Project Censored were for me eye-opening, and in the same time it was a relief because I was hearing things that made sense. Everything makes sense now for me. Like, okay, I got it. I got that, and a real picture of why it works like this. So about my story, since I came here and since I started getting in depth about climate justice, I have this obsession about big oil. And last year I took a student's class, and I was looking for a story about big oil. And so I was looking at Rex Tillerson, ExxonMobil, Nigeria, and this is very common. That Nigeria is a corrupted government. That's nothing new. And at the very last week before we had to give back our stories, well, we had to give our stories to the class, to the teacher. So I just came by accident to this story that Big Oil was colonizing. Also, I like this word, colonizing. Colonizing prestigious universities like Harvard, MIT.
City for what it is, a beautiful place with amazing people that I've yet to find anywhere else in the world. However, if you turn on the news, that's not how Richmond is portrayed. Richmond, being a predominantly black and brown city, is considered to be this crime-ridden cesspool of rapists, murderers, and other horrendous things. As a student here, when I talk about where I'm from, people are like, "Are you okay? What is it like out there? Or is it dangerous where you live?" And you know, whatever their intentions are when they ask me these questions, I have to respond like, no, I experience more like harassment here in San Rafael than I ever have in Richmond. And though my story may not be reflective of everyone in the community, it's my experience, so I chose to talk about resilience in Richmond, and our motto is the city of pride and purpose. America's darling, Bernie Sanders, has come to Richmond a lot because we have what's called the Richmond Progressive Coalition. And so lots of really left-wing activists like to come over, give our city council members and anti-Chevron folks conversations and like workshops on how to combat big corporations, and Chevron likes to buy a lot of our city councilmen, our former mayors, you know, people that control how much Chevron can exist. And as someone who lives around 1.5 miles away from Chevron, this affects me a lot. But I wanted people to know what we do. And if Bernie Sanders comes out here and tells us that, as it says here, we can't allow them to take over Richmond or to take over America, which is something that we may disagree on, but it's important to me. I felt that, you know, with all of our stories that we've talked about so far are immensely important. I would say mine has a more positive spin to it, which is something I was really looking for when I was asked to write for Project Censored, or write for the assignment to be potentially published in Project Censored. So, praising this beautiful city that is often misunderstood and often considered to be bad, because a lot of the things we do as a city, as progressive organizations, are bad, but by the mainstream standards. Because why would you want people to mobilize against one of the biggest corporations in the world, against big oil? What benefit does that give CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, or Disney? Nothing. It's a pain in their ass, and we want it to be buried. So why not make one of the biggest plants in the country, this horrible place, publicize it as this atrocious place where no matter what, and if you cross the city lines, you're going to get bumped, you're going to get assaulted. A big scary man is going to come and get you. So I decided to change that narrative, and had it not been for Susan and Project Censored selecting my article to be publicized and through their network, I wouldn't have had that platform, and I'm grateful to Susan and to the editors of Project Censored for giving me that. Thank you.
So they all found some really important news stories, and I'm really excited that they were able to have a platform. I am grateful to all of you for doing that. I think you should clap for them one more time. Don't you want to do Project Censored? Don't you guys want to do it? You got to take my clap. You can get published. We know that is the magic word for you, those of you that want to transfer, if you're in that world. So there's a lot of good stuff to say about the project. I think as a teaching tool, it definitely is a great way to foster critical thinking, because we're asking students to look at a story and analyze the what, when, where, why, kind of what happened in the story, and then question it in comparison to the mainstream narrative. And certainly that story about Richmond goes against the narrative without a doubt. We like good news stories at Project Censored. That's not usually the bulk of what the book gets, but we get excited when there are good news stories that are sort of censored. So that's always an option. I always have at least one student in any class at any given time who's like, man, please don't make me write about something really sad. And so I'm like, go find something happy. And they're out there, they are out there. There is good stuff happening. It's not all gloom and doom. And highlighting the positives of what's going on culturally is really important. So I have to shamelessly plug that you should buy a book, but I'm gonna tell you why, and then maybe you're gonna want to buy a book. So part of what I do is I give my students free books, but if I sell one book, I can give 4 students a free book. So that's just my little shameless plug. They're $20. So just consider that if you were needing some light reading anyways, this would be a good thing to pick up on your way home. It does help you fall asleep, because I use it in my classroom, and so I'll read before bed, and I usually sleep well. So yeah, I think that's it for what I'm going to say, but I think if there's questions from the audience, then the panel can take questions, or if you just want to chat offline, we can do that as well. Yes, sir?
Can you give us some examples of stories that were in Project Censored one year, and then maybe because of that, they made it into the mainstream media?
So there's one I'm thinking of in particular. It's the sexual assault of a particular woman of color in the military. Military rape and assault was something that was covered probably when I was still in Santa Rosa with you. It was one of the stories, probably your year, like maybe 2013 or so. And I would say about a year and a half later, the mainstream media was picking it up, and there was all sorts of trials on Capitol Hill about it, the sexual assault of women in the military, that one. Yeah. And then there's another one, I can't remember right the second, but generally speaking, we do something called Deja Vu for the book, where we look back at the year's previous censored stories and see what's happened since. And so sometimes we're looking to see, has there been mainstream media press on it, and is it kind of because Project Censored put it out there, or is it just getting so much groundswell? And so sometimes we find that things do get covered. I don't know if Deja Vu people, anybody want to talk about, like if you want to talk about, like, we did, for the 40th anniversary, we did the myth of Black progress, and that was during, that story was spanning since the 70s, kind of about how, oh, yay, civil rights, everything's all good, we're all equal now, what are we worried about? To kind of dispel that. Well, actually, there's a lot of stuff that's underlying that's made it so that there's a lot of inequality, and here's this. And so your group did that. Do you want to talk about it?
Sure.
Do you want to come up? Do you want me to give you the mic?
Yeah, so I worked on a Deja Vu story that was about the myth of Black excellence and Black equality in our social sphere here in the United States. There has been this ongoing narrative since the 60s and 70s that, well, civil rights legislation was signed and everything's gravy now. And I hate to tell you, but that gravy is lumpy and dry and unappealing. In my article that I co-wrote with several other students, we talked about how the fiscal inequality is one of the biggest markers and has done nothing but increase since 1970. Black people, African American people, whichever you prefer to call them, it kind of depends on each individual, are not on equal footing with white Americans. We're just not, sorry to say. And while that legislation has done a lot to make it illegal to do certain things on paper. It hasn't really changed the way that our schools are segregated. Public schools are massively segregated now. Ava DuVernay has a documentary on Netflix right now about that. I think it's called Teach One, and I might be wrong about the title. There's just, it runs the gamut. Any particular marker for equality, be it healthcare, be it education, be it financial, be it home ownership, be it progressive movement in the workplace, African Americans are falling behind and have been for decades. And yet there is this prevalent myth in our country that, you know, we're doing good. You know, we have that black president. We're doing all right. And you know what? We ain't doing all right. So that, looking back at several decades of this idea that we're doing okay and therefore we have nothing to address is kind of, in my personal opinion, how we ended up with things like Charlottesville. And, you know, people duking it out in Berkeley, where I work. It's just how it happens. So there needs to be kind of this, there needs to be a critical lens about these myths that we tell each other, that we tell ourselves as a country about where we're at and what we're doing and how our past has affected us. As a people, we have a very short-term memory when it comes to the news. And the news cycle really perpetuates this. You know, 48-hour news cycle, nobody's even talking about Las Vegas. When was the last time you heard anything about Fukushima? People are still suffering in that part of the world. People are still suffering from cataclysms all over the world. That, you know, they get a little bit of a blip here and a blip there, but there isn't even any kind of like roundup at the end of the year. Well, here's all the terrible things that happened, and here's what we're doing about them. Because 9 times out of 10, we ain't doing much of nothing. So that is one of the great things about like the Deja Vu articles. It goes back, it looks over what's gone right since the article was written, what's gone wrong since the article was written, and what mainstream media has had to say about it, which is often crickets. So yeah, I really enjoyed working on the Deja Vu article, and I am super thankful to Suzanne for giving me the opportunity to work on that.
Any other questions? Yeah.
One of the articles that got my attention was how top 10 or 10 of the major recipients of U.S. aid legitimized slavery. Has there been any follow-up on that? I think it was 2015 or 2016.
2015. So can you tell me the story a little bit?
Yeah, it was about the top 10 recipients of U.S. practice or legitimized slavery.
Boy, if I had a brain to remember every top 25
Okay,
for the last
I just
5
wondered.
years, I'm so sorry.
No, I don't want you
honestly.
to have to look it up. I just wondered if anything was being done to follow up, but I guess not.
In the years that I was responsible for the Deja Vu chapter, that story did not come across our plate. Sometimes they're pre-selected for us and told that these are the stories that you want to work on. So I actually don't know, but that's an interesting thing to look into. If I can find the story, I'd be happy to look it up.
I'm trying to find it. I just saw it.
Would you find it? And I'll give you my email, and then I'll give you some feedback. I'm happy to get back to you on that. That's an important story. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, where are you teaching now?
Here.
You are here? 'Cause
Yeah.
Tom Graham was having the journalism department. Is he here anymore?
I don't know. I do it out of sociology. I'm not a journalism person.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It'd be good. It'd be good to have journalism doing it here, for sure.
Well, I took journalism here, but they said, this was just a few years ago, 3 years ago, and they said they were going to continue with it.
Well, they don't have the SO Times anymore, right?
Right.
So, yeah, that's interesting. Should we
Okay, books and cookies on the back table.
Books and cookies on the back table. Books are here, cookies wherever Dave has them.
All right.
So hey, thank you, Dave, for hosting this.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.